We're going to look today at the A17 Tetrarch. It was the Mark 7 light tank, to give it its proper title. And in fact, it was the second but last of the light tanks. The British Army had decided to give up light tanks at about this time. The only thing is, and what makes it outstanding compared with any earlier light tank, is the armament. In this case, it's got a 3-inch howitzer, but normally it would carry a 2-pounder gun, which was about the same as the average cruiser tank. Come to that, about the same as the infantry tank or any tank the British made. So it was well armed for its day by its standards. It dates from about 1941. It was built by the Metropolitan Carriage, Wagon and Finance Company in Birmingham, but they were heavily bombed while they were producing it, so production was rather slow. But it's quite an unusual and interesting tank, and we'll come to why it's in this glorious wooden structure later on. Now, to begin with, it's just an ordinary light tank. It's of typical riveted construction, 16 millimeters of armour on the front, which is not bad for a light tank. The driver sits in here, and you have 2 men in the turret, a gunner and a commander. But the really unusual thing about the Tetrarch is the way it steers. It's got a system which was actually invented by a chap called Leslie Little. Leslie Little replaced Sir John Carden at Vickers when Carden was killed, and he's the man probably responsible for this steering system. The tank runs on 4 quite large wheels, large diameter wheels. The wheels themselves are actually armoured. They form part of the defensive nature of the side of the tank. But the main thing is that they're on hydro-pneumatic struts which come down from the hull to the suspension, and each wheel is on a pivot, so that when this tank wants to, it can turn a corner, and it does it by moving all the wheels. But basically the outer wheels sort of bend outwards like that, and the inner ones do an odd bit of geometry, and it meant that the thing could be driven down the road like an ordinary car. It doesn't skid steer. Well, it will if you want it to, but it has a handbrake, normal sort of up and down handbrake, and if you push it down and pull it to one side and then pull it up, it brakes that side, so you can skid steer on the handbrake. It's quite an unusual system because it means you're using one lever to do both jobs, and it works quite well. The tank's powered by a Meadows 12-cylinder horizontal engine, rated at about 165 horsepower, and that's quite an unusual system. It was the only engine that will fit in the tank. It goes obviously behind the turret in the engine bay there, and being horizontal, it doesn't take up so much room. But it was the first time anyone had tried that sort of engine in a tank, and it did work quite well. A few of these tanks were sent to Russia. Heaven alone knows why. The Russians didn't like them and they didn't particularly want them. But they had about 20 and they played around with them, took some publicity photos, for our benefit, I suspect. It means that the only other surviving Tetrarch, and there are only 2, is this one here and the one in the museum in Kubinka in Russia. They're the only 2 Tetrarchs I know of that have survived. Later on, they were used for Operation Ironclad, which was the invasion of Madagascar. Only a very few of them were used, but that was the only time they were used in the ordinary ground role. Later on, they come to some sort of prominence, and it only involved 6 of them, including the one with the close support howitzer, and they were taken in these wooden things, which are actually, and this is the remains of one, a General Aircraft Hamilkar Glider, and it was quite a big glider. It was made for these tanks. They weren't intended as airborne tanks, but by 1944 they were so light it didn't matter, and they were heaved into the gliders. They were reversing, had a big door up here, and they flew them across the channel. It weighs about 7 tons, so it's quite a load even for this glider to pull, but it could cope. One of them actually broke loose over the channel, broke out of the confines of the glider, smashed through the door, and ended up at the bottom of the English Channel, still with the crew in it. Quite remarkable really, but otherwise they flew across quite successfully. They'd normally be hauled into the air by a Sterling bomber. Invariably the tank gliders took off from Tarrant Rushton, which is an airfield not far away from here, it's just up the road. But it was the gliders' main airfield in southern England, and they all took off from there and went across. Whether there was any point in landing a 1941 tank on a 1944 battlefield remains to be discussed, but I don't think it was worth it myself. I think the tanks were out of date at that time and should have been put to rest. But they landed with 6th Airborne Division on the flank of the British Army, quite well inland, and when they came out of the gliders, they mainly ran over discarded parachute lines, which got tangled round the suspension and brought them all to a halt, except for two. Two actually broke loose and went into action, but they didn't last more than 10 minutes in action because they were up against 1944 model German tanks, which wiped them out. One of them actually ran over a mine, but that's how they were lost. The remainder were usually dug in as machine gun positions for the infantry, and in that role they worked perfectly well. However, they did have an odd side effect. 21st Panzer Division, which was based at Caen, had come out of its lair and was moving towards the British beaches, the idea being to fulfill Rommel's dream of driving the British and the Americans back into the sea from the Normandy beaches. Well, when they heard that tanks had landed from the air behind them, they got a bit nervous and decided to go back to Caen anyway. They needn't have worried, these tanks wouldn't have given them any sort of fright at all, but they decided to go back. And it was the landing of these tanks that put off 21st Panzer Division and put them off going further forward. Otherwise they would have reached the coast. So it is a very interesting little vehicle. The very first time we'd used an airborne tank, and almost not quite the last, but you can understand why. Hardly worth it, but quite impressive, the very fact you can do it at all. But that's the Tetrarch. That's roughly how it works. It's a very simple tank, but it has this steering system in, which is well worth taking note of. I drove it myself once, a long time ago, and you've got a steering wheel in the cab here, and I just got in the cab and grabbed the steering wheel at the 10 to do position, as you normally would, and steered it around a few obstacles and skinned me knuckles. They were a right old mess for a while. And when I got out, I saw a chap from workshops who said to me, "Oh, you've been driving the Tetrarch, have you?" And I looked at my knuckles and I said, "Yes." He said, "You should have held the wheel underneath. If you held it at the bottom, at the 6:30 position, you'd get a much smoother steer without skinning your knuckles." But I didn't know that at the time, so I made a complete pig's ear of it as usual. Thanks for watching that. If you've enjoyed it, then if you care to, subscribe to the YouTube channel, because that will help a lot, but also support us on Patreon. Thanks very much.